I assume you're not going to make a presentation for the Barrington Area Council of Governments. Thank you. Village of Hawthorne Woods has already stated that they're not going to make a presentation and save their comments to the public comment time. All right, thank you. Is the Village of Tower Lakes here? Catherine Leitner?
She's in Ireland. She will not be making
All right, thank you. Copperfield Homeowners Association, Greg Gerke.
I'll be waiting that. I've already had my speech.
Thank you. Timberlake Civic Organization, Nancy McGranahan.
Good evening. My name is Paul Dietzen, D-I-E-T-Z-E-N. I'm a resident of Timberlake at 456 East Oak Creek.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry. I am the current president of the Timberlake Civic Association. Our community is located across Route 12, right off of Timberlake Drive from the Dimucci property. We consist of 187 homes that surround a 43-acre man-made lake, which is the center of our community. We are here tonight to talk about the opposition of the rezoning project. The Timberlake board members have gone through the neighborhood, going door to door to talk to the community about this rezoning effort. We've been met with overwhelming opposition to this proposal. As a board, we have drafted a resolution which I would like to enter into evidence this evening to the board. You've all heard from me speak before of the quality of life that we are very concerned with in our neighborhood. This will directly affect us, this project. I will keep this very short. We do have other members of our community to speak on behalf of Timberlake this evening. I would like to thank everyone for the opportunity to hear us, and so we can voice our concerns. And, this evening we will start with Nancy. Nancy, you're going to start? Okay. So we're going to have Steve start up with our presentation this evening. And again, I would like to thank you in advance for the opportunity.
Good evening. Thank you for this opportunity, Mr. Chairman and the board, to speak in regards to Timberlakes Association and the surrounding properties. My name is Steve Reese. I live at 17 Thornfield Lane, Hawthorne Woods, Illinois. I'm the original founder of ACRE. I created ACRE in about 1994 or 1996 in response to a development by the Kimball Hill Homes Development Corporation to put a high-density housing project on the subject property that we're talking about today. And over the years have been asked to participate and testify in many regards in respect to this particular property. And tonight I'm going to be testifying in regards to water quality issues as associated with the runoff of this particular property. My comments are based not so much in objecting to the specific property, but rather that you must pay attention to specific details in regards to any planned unit development in respect to stormwater runoff and the pollutants that they might contain prior to granting any zoning, because once the PUD is granted, you will not have the legal right based on state law and county law to affect or make any changes in that respect. And these changes are what I would define as significant. The commentary that I'm going to be offering tonight is based upon testimony that was offered by Mr. Dan Lau in the 1996 and 1997 testimony and hearings with the Village of North Barrington in regards to the Taubman Mall proposal. Mr. Lau has since moved from the area and now lives in Wisconsin near Milwaukee, is unable to attend, but has agreed to be able to answer your questions if you have questions with regards to his testimony. His testimony has been submitted as part of the legal documents associated with the Taubman testimony and has been submitted to as evidence in regards to this hearing. They would affect, in that evidence, pages 923 to pages 963. Give me a minute, I gotta get my glasses. That's what happens when you get old. Mr. Lau is a expert in stormwater management. He has a master's degree from Colorado State University in hydrology and civil engineering, and is currently vice president of water hydrology and civil engineering at Camp Dresser McKee, a very prominent civil engineering firm based in Milwaukee and who has offices throughout the United States. My primary discussion tonight will be the environmental impact of what's going on. This is a very sensitive area from an environmental aspect, and I would reflect on what was stated before, that Timber Lake is considered, or I would consider it as a jewel in regards to the area from an environmental perspective. It's a shallow water lake, probably about 24 feet deep on the average. And really provides an extraordinary environment for the surrounding residents. If you choose to approve things on this area on the current consideration without making this subject to restrictions from a stormwater management or pollution perspective, as I stated before, you will not have an opportunity to rescind those choices or make other choices. The PUD only requires compliance with ordinances and standards. The PUDs do not require any developer to do anything above and beyond published ordinances. There's been a lot of references to the book that supposedly contains all the stuff that they're supposed to do, but as stated previously, most of this is shall or may or can as opposed to must. The majority of water that comes as a runoff, may I have the next slide please? The majority of water that comes as a runoff from this area, well, let me back up, I'm sorry, I got the slides in the wrong area. Next slide please. The majority of water that flows from this area, there's a certain percentage of this water that flows from this specific area here, the northern part of this property, into the Timber Lakes region, and the remaining amount of water flows into this region here, which affects Windstone and Flint Creek. Previous slide, please. There is significant plant and animal species that are found in and around both of these locations, with Timber Lakes being probably the primary or the best example of diversified water species and diversified animal species. Mr. Wagoner indicated it would comply or exceed Squaw Creek standards in regards to water flow, and that sounds wonderful, but he knows there's a lot more going on here than just the water flow itself. The Lake County Stormwater Management only addresses the flooding and stormwater quantity, and it addresses water quality from a particulate or suspended solids perspective, but not a pollutants perspective. And what's really at issue here is the pollutants inspector. There are probably, in developments of this size, as example from information received from the shopping center development in Vernon Hills, which is probably quite similar in size and scope to the shopping center. They typically use about 500 tons of rock salt used by Westfield on average, but it has been as much as 1,000 tons of salt depending on actual snowfall and weather conditions. Average Chicago area snowfall is 38 inches, but snowfall has been recorded in the area as much as 90 inches in 1978 and 85 inches in 1977, which is what would drive the amount of rock salt that's being used from 500 tons to 1,000 tons. And that's an enormous amount of sodium chloride entering into the system. So the question is, rock salt is used on roads throughout the counties. What's the big deal here in regards to rock salt? Well, the difference is that in Lake County, all the other municipal systems flow into a major municipal stormwater management system. So the answer is the dilution rate. This is a finite system. This has a direct impact on the water quality and the sustainability of life and ecosystems of the attaining or the adjoining systems, both in Timber Lake and also Flint Creek. Other areas, Vernon Hills, Grenee, Schaumburg, have a municipal-wide stormwater management system, many of which feed into Fox River, Des Plaines River, and Lake Michigan. This does not. This feeds directly into environmentally sensitive areas. The IEPA standard is 500 milligrams per liter of sodium. Based on approximately 500 tons of salt being used in this development for the size environment that they're talking about, that would drive the potential or the existing sodium rate to about 8,000 milligrams per liter, or 16 times the IEPA standard. And there is no way to mitigate that. In fact, actually what will take place is that because of this amount of salt that's associated with the flow that goes through Whinstone, and as I mentioned, the flow comes from the south part of the property all through the Whinstone development and goes through all the Whinstone golf courses. What will actually take place is that the salt will accumulate at the bottom of those ponds and resources and will typically kill off all of the plant life at the bottom of those resources. When you kill off the plant life at the bottom of those water resources, you essentially kill off the remainder of the life in that pond. So anything associated with going outbound from this property through Whinstone, through Flint Creek, into Biltmore Lake, and into the Fen will be directly affected by the salt impact that's associated here. And there really is no way to mitigate this unless you have a zero runoff requirement. That's doable, but from an acreage perspective, for a zero runoff requirement, you're going to need a lot more acres for stormwater retention. That's what's being presented as a general guideline from the applicant. In fact, the applicant hasn't really stipulated anything in regards to stormwater management runoff. We don't know if they're planning on allocating 10 acres or 20 acres or 40 acres or no acres in stormwater management runoff. And that's the problem, because if you don't mitigate the stormwater runoff and the salt issues long before you grant the PUD, you're going to kill all of the life in both Timber Lakes and also all of the associated runoff areas in Whinstone and associated properties. And the sodium is not the only problem. The potentials for chloride rates are 10 times the IEPA standards, and for the same reasons. There's no way to mitigate the chloride runoff because there's no way to strain or dilute the water from an appropriate perspective to prevent these kinds of impacts. In addition to the salt, the sodium, and the chloride runoffs that will be attributed to these properties, there are probably somewhere between, according to standards, 3 to 5 tons of oil and gasoline and heavy metals that these same water resources will be impacted by. These heavy metals come from the cars that visit their parking lots. The cars drip oil, they drip automatic transmission fluid, they drip anything that might be associated with fluids associated with the car. When there is a storm, these fluids run into the runoff areas. These runoffs then accumulate into the various stormwater management areas, and these runoffs and heavy metals then accumulate into the associated very sensitive water areas that are directly connected with this. And again, there's no way to mitigate this. There's no way to eliminate these heavy metals and other pollutants. The only management tool that you have at your disposal is zero runoff. And if you don't make it a part of the original requirement or application, you cannot require the applicant to live by those standards. In addition to the oil and gasoline and all the other things that are associated with it, you have unknown tons of garbage like cigarette butts, beverage cups, food court packaging, plastic from products purchased, whatever. We've all seen it. People leave a shopping center, they get into their car, they open their purchase, and what do they do with the packages they receive? They throw them out the window. And where do you think those things are going to go? They're going to go into the stormwater runoff system. There's no way to prevent those kinds of things. Those are going to be pollutants to these highly sensitive areas. So I'm not going to stand here and tell you that you need to object to this proposal. That's not my purpose here. My purpose is to demand standards that will be associated with providing either zero runoff or 100% clean runoff to ensure that the environmentally sensitive areas of Timber Lake and Flint Creek are not affected by this proposal. Does the board have any questions?
Mark? No. Gary?
Your Timber Lake Homeowners Association, what does it do now for its lake?
I would defer to the TLA Homeowners Association. They do quite a bit, and there's monitoring systems that I know are in place and so on. Go ahead.
That was going to be the second part of our presentation. Okay.
Well, then wait.
Let's hold off.
Okay.
Carol?
How difficult is zero runoff to attain?
Not difficult at all. Very obtainable. The problem is not difficulty, but the problem is size. There are two factors that affect it. One is the total number of acres or square feet that are used for retention systems, and that is typically going to be quite large compared to typical stormwater runoff management systems. Probably twice or 3 times those normal sizes. And also depth. So if you have a shallow water runoff system that's 2 or 3 feet in depth, which is a very safe or environmentally friendly environment, you would probably need 50 or 60 acres. If you choose to have a zero runoff system that is 20 or 30 feet in depth, which is not safe because if someone falls into it, they could drown, then you might only need 25 or 30 acres. But regardless of whether it's 25 or 30 or 50 or 60, it needs to be defined and stipulated prior to the granting of any PUD, or you don't get to do anything at all.
Dennis?
Are there shopping areas around here that have zero runoff that you could cite for us? Help us understand exactly what we're talking about?
Close. There's a shopping center on South Barrington at Route 59 and Higgins Road.
Arboretum.
The Arboretum, thank you. Which isn't zero runoff. They have a stormwater retention system, but they've also allocated over 20 acres in regards to space for water definition. So the water is collected in other ponds and is then moved off to these shallow water ponds, which are used to take the salt out of the system through plant and aquatic life. Their ability is to be able to handle all of the salt and all of the runoff over a long period of time. So the total allocation that they have is probably, I don't know, I'm guessing, 40 to 45 acres of space to accomplish this goal. Again, these are accomplishable or doable goals, but they have to be defined before you grant the PUD.
So do I hear you saying it's not so much the development, but the requirements for how the development takes place?
Bingo. On how they manage the stormwater management. So the development that we're talking about is not a zero water runoff, but they have an environmentally sensitive area directly south of them. And being sensitive to that area, the water that they're now allowing to run off into that area is almost pure in comparison to most stormwater management runoff. And that's how they mitigated it. So I guess to answer your question, you can mitigate it, but it's complicated and it needs to be paid attention to.
But doable.
But doable.
John?
Would you seem to be knowledgeable about this? The calcium chloride, if it were a stipulation, or I don't even know if this is possible, that calcium chloride not be used, but rather the developer be switched to a sand and gravel mixture for ice control?
Probably not going to happen. We presented the same question to the Taubman Group, and there was testimony provided in that regard that I'll refer to again in those 923 to 963 pages for your reference. There is a more expensive product, which is about 3 or 4 times the cost. It's a potassium chloride product. But the reality of it is that the developer or the property owner will need to ensure that people visiting the property do not slip and fall on snow and ice and increase the opportunity for lawsuit against the property owner. And the only way to do that is to salt, salt, and salt again, because they don't want snow, they don't want ice, they don't want anything. They want it to be dry pavement. And if you ever gone to a major shopping center in the middle of winter, whether it's Woodfield or Deer Park or whatever, look around the streets have globs of salt on the street, and the streets are bone dry because they salt and they salt again. So yes, again, doable, but nobody's going to spend the money for potassium chloride as opposed to sodium chloride. Thank you.
Got it, John? Now, it's my understanding that zero runoff is not done because it's so expensive. Is that true?
It is more expensive than other stormwater mitigation aspects. I don't disagree. And in most cases, zero runoff is not really a necessity. There's a lot of people in the environmental world, you know, the tree huggers as they're called, that think this is a requirement just because they don't want to see, you know, anything enter the ecosystem. And for the most part, it's not really a valid concern because of dilution rates. If you look at, say, Vernon Hills and the Westfield Shopping Center area, they have an entire community stormwater management system. So regardless of how much salt they apply to Westfield or the Vernon Hills Shopping Center, it gets diluted 1,000-fold times more than it will be on this development site and dumped into a municipal stormwater management system that is receiving millions of gallons of water from around the entire community and is then being dumped into an environment like the Des Plaines River, which is receiving millions of gallons of water from everywhere else from a stormwater management system. That simply doesn't apply here. This is a finite system. These environments are a very defined and contained environment. The amount of stormwater runoff that goes into Timber Lakes is very finite. Timber Lakes, as they discuss, will talk to you about their water measurement systems, salinity and suspended solids and all these other things. It's a shallow water lake. You dump 8,000 parts per million of salt into this lake, you will kill off everything in that lake. It's unsustainable.
I'm going to ask staff. As I recall, reading, I think it's Appendix B, it's extensive amount of material on the runoff. Basically, what they're proposing is far below what is required in the UDO. Also, there was quite a bit of material on snow removal and de-icing.
This is Chairman Raymond.
Can you help us out there?
Questioning.
Absolutely, Mr. Chairman. I have Kurt Wolford, Chief Engineer for Stormwater Management Commission, who's here to address that question.
Thank you.
All right, good evening. Kurt Wolford, Chief Engineer, Lake County Stormwater Management Commission. The concern about runoff, every site has runoff, and release rates are the controls that control the flow rate, so the water is detained and released slowly. There's 26 watersheds in Lake County, and all of them have what's called an allowable release rate. What is a reasonable rate of runoff that can be released? Illinois drainage law allows a property owner to drain onto a lower land. Lower lands have to accept that rate of flow. And state law says you cannot unreasonably increase the rate of flow. So these reasonable requirements have been determined, and they're pretty consistent for all of northeastern Illinois. And in Lake County, that reasonable flow rate is 0.4 cubic feet per second for the 2-year storm, 0.15 cubic feet per second for the 100-year storm. There's one single watershed in Lake County that has the most restrictive release rates, and that's the Squaw Creek watershed. The Dimucci property is not located at all within that watershed. The proposal is to control the rate of flow to that higher or the lower, most restrictive release rate in Lake County. Like I said, there's only one of those. Regarding flooding, the property is located in the headwaters of the Tower Lake Drain and of the Flint Creek watershed. So right now, it's an agricultural field. Water drains off the site undetained. Pesticides, fertilizers, total suspended solid, bare dirt, that all drains off the site. Through development, our watershed development ordinance has been in place for 20 years, controls the development, does address water quality, does address hydrocarbons, oils, and grease. So, my point of being in the headwaters of the system, when you control the water, instead of letting it rush down the system, you're holding on to it. There's a delayed effect where that quantity of water is not added cumulatively downstream, and it gives an opportunity for the downstream waters to drain out before that release rate, before that peak flow comes into the drainage lake. So the effect would be potentially reduced flow rates in the drainage system and reduced flood heights. The concerns about water quality are valid, and rock and chlorides are a hard pollutant to control. And the oils, the grease, the total suspended sediment, that can be addressed through best management practices, use of native vegetation, different types of water quality BMPs. They are part of the watershed development ordinance, which is a county-wide regulation, not only for Hawthorne Woods, North Barrington, all of unincorporated Lake County. All of the county has to comply with these minimum standards. But I do agree that there's a trade-off. The total suspended solids, the fertilizers, the pesticides. Once you stabilize a site, you might address all those pollutants, but then there's the chloride concerns. And as part of the appendix that was submitted, there was a condition addressing the maintenance plan. And Lake County takes Lake County Stormwater Management Commission, the Lake County Division of Transportation, has taken proactive steps to address the chlorides that are entering our lakes and streams. We have de-icing workshops. The Division of Transportation doesn't just lay down 100% salt. They use a mixture of beet juice to try to reduce this. And those are the types of conditions that were mentioned in the development standards to come up with a maintenance plan that addresses how to maintain a site during the wintertime. Typically that's with certain snow plowing techniques, what materials to use. So that was a condition, and I believe it's still in there, to try to minimize the amount of salts that would enter the waterway. And the other item is that a commercial site of 100 acres, if you're not going to be developing half of it, well, you've already cut off half of the impervious surface. So minimization of impervious surface is most of the time the #1 way to address these additional pollutants. But I will agree that, you know, something, if we had our way at Stormwater Management Commission to say find an alternative practice, but safety sometimes trumps that. If cars are going to be driving off icy roads versus frogs dying, that doesn't really shake out too well.
Thank you.
So I would agree with this presentation. However, I would take exception to some of his comments in regards to what stormwater management is doing. Stormwater management has provided recommendations, studies, advisory groups, all those kinds of things, but there are no regulations currently in stormwater management that define or require specific limitations in regards to sodium or chlorides. Flow rate is not our issue here. We're certainly sensitive to flow rate, and we certainly understand that stormwater management will pay every attention to flow rates because that's an important issue in regards to a total water environment and suspended solids. But flow rates are the issue here. It's sodium and it's chloride. And the only way to mitigate it is to have a zero runoff. And if you don't put that in as part of the PUD, you're not going to get it, and you're going to kill all the waters that are downstream from this property.
Carol?
Has the county worked with villages and with shopping centers that are within village boundaries to help mitigate and to help decrease to working toward a zero number?
Yeah, let me just address the concept of zero runoff. The water has to go somewhere. So if it's not going off-site and being discharged, it's going to go into the groundwater. So it's going to go somewhere. Diluted water, gravity is going to make the water go down, and it's going to get into the aquifer system. So I just wanted to clarify that. Yes, the Stormwater Management Commission works with many different stakeholders, with communities. We have watershed plans where we work with certain property owners, with retail and commercial entities to address these issues. The watershed plans are not regulatory, but our watershed development ordinance is, and I'll repeat, they do address total suspended solids, hydrocarbons, oils and grease. They do not address the chloride issue. So that's where we have to step outside of our regulations, and we do proactively try to work with communities, with different landowners through these watershed-based plans to address the chloride issues.
Thank you.
I would like to once again take exception to something that he had said. He indicated that the gravity pulls the water from a zero retention system into the aquifer, and that is correct. That does take place. But by the time it enters the aquifer, the soils of the ground have absorbed all the sodium, all the chloride. There is literally no impact on the aquifer system from from water that penetrates down 30 feet. I'm done. I think I've occupied enough of your time. I'd like to provide contact information for the person who gave this original testimony and the Taubman information. His name once again is Dan Lau, L-A-U. He is Vice President of a civil engineering firm, Camp, Dresser, and McKee. His telephone number is 414-203-4002. His email address, let me my glasses again, laudh@cbm.com. And he's agreed, I had a conversation with him earlier today, that he'd be more than welcome to take your calls, to answer your questions in regards to anything I've presented here tonight or anything as part of the original 1996-1997 Taubman testimony. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, in closing, can I just bring up one fact? The Taubman plan, when that was presented, our ordinances have changed and become more restrictive since then. So in 1999, we did not have water quality and buffer provisions in our ordinance. Today, our ordinance does address those issues. So to look at an older plan, the regulations in effect at that time may not have addressed those issues, whereas now the ordinance does have those provisions in place.
I agree with that comment, except it still only addresses flow rates and suspended solids. He does not address sodium chloride or sodium chloride content.
Okay, thank you. I don't think we're going to solve this debate tonight. Mrs. McGranahan?
Yes, sir.
How much time do you need? Your organization's already used up half hour.
We have a lot of questions. We have about three more witnesses to testify. My portion will be less than 10 minutes. And then we have Ray Gerke, who's going to be doing about 5 minutes, and then there's Matt LaSousa. So he'll be, about 15 minutes.
Let's take a break.
Thank you.